The Chris Johnston Show.
Let's go!
Your number one destination for a behind-the-scenes look at the game of hockey.
Is this thing on?
Here's NHL insider Chris Johnston and host Julian McKenzie.
CJ, a lot of players had things to say on Tuesday, whether it's Sidney Crosby, Jack Hughes talking about his brother Quinn, Rasmus Andersson. There's a lot to get to on today's episode. I want to start with Sidney Crosby, who was part of the NHL PA Player Tour in Vegas yesterday. Obviously, questions about his future. We've delved in on that topic quite a bunch on the CJ show. What did you think about some of the quotes that circulated from that tour? Particularly one, I'll just read a bit here. I get it. Trust me, growing up a Montreal fan and being from not too far from there, I understand how passionate they are. Obviously, that's in the context of Canadiens fans wondering if he'll one day join that organization. And obviously the speculation that's run rampant about that. And to kind of paraphrase to the other end of that quote, to know that a team like that wants you, it's not the end of the world. It could be worse. And he smiles as he said it. I know Pat Brisson also spoke to his agent, but let's start with Sidney Crosby. What did you think of how he handled the question about his future?
Well, I think that we've been justified in our conversations that we've had on the show, including the last time I remember we got into this topic. I just mentioned that this is a huge topic of conversation behind the scenes. Why can't it be in front of the scenes? I didn't think that Crosby himself, he didn't add any fuel to the fire there. I think that really what he's saying is he understands why it is a topic of conversation and curiosity, when it comes to his future. To me, the interesting quotes that maybe added a little bit of juice there were the ones that Pat Brisson, his agent from CAA, gave to Pierre LeBrun, our colleague at The Athletic, because he kind of went there and in a more forceful way publicly than you might expect. But, really, to boil down his thoughts, he was saying Sidney Crosby to him should be in the playoffs every year. And we're now 3 years removed from his last playoff game. And, obviously Pittsburgh, I don't think as we start looking ahead to this season, too many people would have them predicted to be in a playoff position this year. So, my own sense of this situation is it's there's certainly nothing imminent. Crosby's at the start of that 2-year extension he signed, last fall. I don't think we're going to be talking about him actually being traded probably even this season. I suppose let's see where we're at as the trade deadline gets closer. But the door felt opened a little bit more than it had been in the past to the possibility of that one day happening. And maybe that's almost like the progression that has to go on here. Everybody's got to get a little more and more comfortable with the idea before something actually goes down. But, definitely a good preseason talking point kind of moment. And, the one thing I wonder with Crosby is, he goes through the Four Nations last year. Obviously, a big thing he's looking forward to this season is the Olympics. Like, does that satiate him enough? Like, getting that kind of back into the best on best environment, is that enough where he's like, okay, at least I'm getting these experiences. It gives him something to want to peak for within his own season. Does that satiate him, or is that almost like a reminder, oh man, I really got to get back to the playoffs? Because, the one thing that remains true to this day is I think he is a player that would see some value in being a one franchise guy. Obviously, he's synonymous with that Penguins franchise. He was a huge part of turning them around and winning 3 Stanley Cups there and all those things. But I still don't see the Penguins timeline back to being competitive lining up with his own, although don't bet against him because he's still pretty darn good at age 38.
Oh, that's for damn sure. Speaking of wanting to be in the playoffs every year, I mean, the Montreal Canadiens being implicated in these rumors, that's a team that's trying to be in the playoffs every year. Another team that percolates in my mind a lot, we've brought them up before, the Colorado Avalanche. Nathan McKinnon, his boy, plays over there. He is trying to stay in the playoffs every year. I mean, those two teams for me seem like the top potential landing spots for a Crosby trade, if that even ever was something we needed to discuss or even get to. I'm always just curious, though, is there any other team that could ever lurk in the surface and try to land number 87? Yeah, it has to be other teams, right? Like, we're talking about one of the best players to ever live.
Yeah, if that opportunity became available. I mean, what's not clear, obviously the Penguins aren't going to really shop Sidney Crosby.
No.
Like I think it's going to be more of a, if it ever gets to the day where he is ready to move on, I would think that's just a conversation he'd have with Kyle Dubas and the senior management in Pittsburgh and just say, I want to go here. And then, the trade would get made. I don't even know what that trade would look like, honestly, because it would be such a unique thing in hockey to have a player of that stature moved in a cap world, again, where he being Sidney Crosby controls the entire process with his no movement clause, not to mention, I think just the debt that the Penguins organization, has to him to do the right thing. For sure, those teams make sense. Look, the Montreal Canadiens thing, as he mentions in those quotes, he grew up a fan of the team. They clearly have a hole in their lineup down the middle that, I don't think it's hard to imagine whether it would be him as a number one center and Suzuki going down to number two or whatever. Let's not quibble about the labels in this hypothetical situation. They could use another frontline center. And, he would maybe potentially be joining a team right as it's taking off even more, coming off making the playoffs last year and ready to contend for a cup final kind of team. I mean, that's intriguing, the ties to Colorado with, that's sort of an organization that is quietly, I'd say quietly a little bit, struggled to get over the hump, right? I mean, they're not that far removed from their Stanley Cup win, but there hasn't been the kind of playoff success since then that you'd almost expect. Obviously they dealt away Mikko Rantanen last year. I think there's an argument for them, whether it's Crosby or if some other opportunity comes up, in the next 12 months, that they're going to be looking for another sort of star level player. Then you have the personal relationship. But I do think other teams could be part of it if we get there, just because if you're making this move, if you're Sidney Crosby, part of what you're doing is, I suppose, you're satisfying what could be a curiosity. What would it be like to play somewhere else? But then you're obviously doing this to have a chance to win. And so, there are other teams, obviously, besides Montreal and Colorado, that I think we could identify as cup caliber type of teams. We happen to be in an era too where the cap considerations aren't going to be as difficult. We have $95.5 million cap this year, but it's $104 million next season. So, Crosby at $8.7 million cap hit, pretty much everyone in the league, if we look ahead to next summer, could be in a position where they could add him without taking things away. I mean, if we just go high level. So even that now is less of a, where could he fit? Because the numbers aren't going to add up. Like I do think, it's a conversation that extends to Connor McDavid as well. Now McDavid's next deal is going to be more than the $9.5, $10 million cap jump that we're going to have from season to season. But when you factor that in, most teams can pay him 15, 16, whatever, 17, whatever he wants to make and still not have to shed much off the roster. So, I think as much as we're in this weird window, Julian, where it does feel like obviously it was a very quiet summer relative to other summers, where there's these CBA changes that we've discussed that might impair trades. I think the one thing we shouldn't sleep on is it's going to be easier for players to move around the league with more cap space being afforded to teams. So it's a long answer to your question. I think you're right to have the Canadiens and Avalanche as sort of the teams first in mind of where he might go, but I don't think the list will end there if he ever gets there. But he's not there yet. That's just the truth. I mean, all that's happened here is they're not just totally saying, hey, why are you even asking about this? I think he's acknowledging, of course, this is a conversation, given his stature in the league and where Pittsburgh's at, but we're not at the point where, I don't think he's ready to do that sort of thing. I mean, look, the other thing I'll point out that maybe hasn't been raised as much, obviously Crosby's a notoriously, guy likes creature of habit, we'll call him. He's got his superstitions. He's obviously very comfortable in Pittsburgh. He spent more than half his life living there. I mean, that's home for him. But the one thing that has changed, the Penguins are going through another ownership change right now. In Kyle Dubas, you've had 3 different GMs in the last 5 or 6 years of that team. There's been a coaching change, obviously, this offseason with Mike Sullivan moving on to coach the Rangers and Dan Hughes coming in to coach the Penguins. This is the last year of Evgeny Malkin's deal. Mm-hmm. And it's widely expected it will be his final NHL season. So, we can point out, yes, Crosby is very comfortable in Pittsburgh and would love to be a Penguin for life. His life in Pittsburgh is changing. It's not the same. And there's been a lot of organizational I don't know if instability is the word, but there's been a lot of disruption because you've had multiple ownership changes in recent years. Different people running a team, different vision maybe for what the future's got to look like. You've got his best hockey playing friend in Malkin likely to be done after this season. I think it all lines up. It's probably going to be a bit of a tearjerker year in Pittsburgh. I think it's going to start to feel like the real end for a lot of players in that team, and obviously fans of that team are potentially going to be waving goodbye to Malkin in the coming months. The other thing is Crosby's got a chance to pass Mario Lemieux this season for the most points ever by a Penguins player. Would obviously be another notch up the all-time scoring list for him in the NHL. So, there's going to be, I think, moments to reflect back on everything that's happened with him there. And then you just wonder, at the end of all that, if perhaps the door is a little bit more open for him to consider a move.
This episode of the Chris Johnston Show is brought to you by ExpressVPN. Have you ever browsed in incognito mode? It's probably not as incognito as you think. In fact, Google recently settled a $5 billion lawsuit after being accused of secretly tracking users in incognito mode. Google's defense: incognito does not mean invisible. In fact, all of your online activity is still 100% visible to a ton of third parties, unless you use ExpressVPN. Without ExpressVPN, these parties can still see every website you visit, even in incognito mode, through your ISP, your mobile network provider, the admin of your Wi-Fi network. ExpressVPN reroutes 100% of your traffic through secure, encrypted servers so third parties can't see your browsing history. It hides your IP address, it's easy to use, and it works on all devices, and rated #1 by top tech reviewers like CNET and The Verge. If I'm out at a hotel, whether in New Jersey, whether in Toronto, Vancouver, it doesn't matter. I don't want hotels looking at my data. What if I want to buy Chris Johnston a Christmas present or something? Like, get him one of those fancy hats he wears all the time. I don't want people to know what I'm doing. Anyway, ExpressVPN, very helpful with that. Protect your online privacy today by visiting expressvpn.com/Johnston. That's expressvpn.com/Johnston. And you can get an extra 4 months free. expressvpn.com/Johnston. How ready are you for a world where, whether it's this time next year or the year after, Sidney Crosby and Connor McDavid are somehow playing for different teams, hypothetically?
Well, it's very possible. Like, I think if anyone wants to sit here and say like that's too preposterous to dream, they're burying their heads in the sand. I mean, it's very, very possible that happens. I mean, I'll throw the chaos scenario at you. What happens if they want to team up somewhere and play together? I mean, who knows what could happen? I'm not saying that that's in the works by any stretch, but when you get players moving, all these things start to become possible. And, as I say, I think in both players' cases, they're going to be looking for the same thing, and that they're going to be looking for a place where they feel they have the best chance to win a Stanley Cup and, continue their careers if they end up moving on. So, we are jumping ahead, but, it's early September, mid-September. We can sort of pie in the sky some of this stuff. And it's probably 20% chance that happens. But even the fact that's 20%, most people would have said 0 at some point in time. And, just the window's opening, I think, on a new era in hockey, and everybody's getting their minds around it. And Connor McDavid, nothing's changed in his situation since we last discussed this on the show, but he's still getting comfortable with what he wants to do next. And obviously Crosby and Pat Brisson, his agent, and others in his life are thinking about what that might look like. And, the roads might lead them to new teams, here in the next, call it 10 to 12 months.
I feel, this is just me talking here, I feel the fact that McDavid is at this crossroads, and even Sidney Crosby as well with his own respective situation, this could be as close to what the NBA experienced in 2010 when LeBron had to make the decision. I mean, I don't think we're going to get to a point where either of those players are going to book out TV time and have the Boys and Girls Club as a sponsor. But I think those two players being stories, and we're wondering about their futures, there's a reason why it should be a big deal. And I understand that some people are thinking, oh man, like, why would we have to talk about this again? But like, we're talking about two of the best players of their era, potentially changing spots. Like, this should be a big deal.
Yeah. If we're not talking about this, what are we talking about? I mean, what could be more important in the NHL? And not only are, you got the similarities in their careers, obviously McDavid was once looking up to Crosby. I mean, they're going to be teammates at the Olympics too for Team Canada. I mean, they're going to try to win a gold medal together in February. I mean, it's going to be an impossible storyline to ignore as long as, McDavid remains unsigned. Now, he could obviously do an extension at some point in time, and then that storyline goes away. The questions I don't think will go away for Crosby unless somehow the Penguins turn into a playoff team magically this year. And, internally, I don't even think they expect that. I mean, I don't think there's a reason to think that's going to happen. So, yeah, if we're not talking about this, then we're missing the whole point of what's going on in the league. So, that was kind of the point I was trying to make a few months ago when we hit on this, is like, I understand if you're a fan of those teams, it's probably not conversation you want to hear. It's not a world you want to imagine, but, pro sports is a big business, and, the number of players that move on. I mean, I thought it was interesting too. Pat Brisson said, to him, Sidney Crosby is like Tom Brady.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Tom Brady was pretty closely associated with the New England Patriots for a long, long time. A massive part of their organizational turnaround, all the Super Bowls they won. And then he spent the last couple seasons of his career in Tampa and won another Super Bowl. I'm not saying that Pat was using that as a literal pattern, but, I think, what he was sort of saying is that even at Tom Brady into his 40s was a difference maker and was someone that other teams wanted to have on their roster. I think Crosby's the same, and who knows, maybe there's a fourth Stanley Cup in his future somewhere down the line. It's hard to imagine it happening in Pittsburgh, but this is what makes sports interesting, is people like to sit around and have a cold beverage of their choice and talk to their friends about this stuff and imagine what could happen. I mean, we're definitely in an era where I think both those guys could move. And as a result of that, as long as that remains on the table, it's going to be something we focus on, and all of our colleagues in the media, and frankly, fans around the league and around the world too. So this is just what it is.
You know who has probably had similar conversations just sitting by a dock somewhere with a beverage of choice in hand? Maybe not necessarily talking about Sidney Crosby as a teammate or Connor McDavid as a teammate, but maybe their own brother. We should probably get to Jack Hughes and his comments yesterday, and the fact that he was asked about, hey, what about the possibility of playing with your brother Quinn Hughes one day? I'll just read the quote verbatim here. Honestly, I'm not afraid to say it. Yeah, I would love for Quinn to. Eventually, I'd love to play with him. And whether that's in New Jersey or at what time that takes, at some point, I want to play with Quinn. But yeah, that's the question going around. They talk about it all day up in Vancouver, I think that's a very interesting quote from Jack Hughes, who's not afraid to say what's on his mind. And I'm sure no one in Vancouver reacted to it. Nope, not a soul.
Well, let's rewind the tape here, right? It was Jim Rutherford who first brought this up at the season-ending press conference in Vancouver. So it's been a topic of conversation of varying importance in that market ever since then, because when you have the president of the team just sort of offer up the idea that it's going to be a challenge potentially to keep Quinn Hughes because of his desire to play with his brothers. And, he did, in Rutherford's quote, he said something, maybe we can control it by acquiring his brothers, but those are not the type of players we typically see move around the league. And, Jack Hughes is signed long-term. Luke Hughes actually is an unsigned restricted free agent right now, trying to get his next deal done with New Jersey, but obviously he's going to be looking for a big contract, and I would think a number of years. So there's a lot of dynamics at play there. Quinn Hughes, the Canucks captain, can sign an extension as of next July 1st. He's 2 years out from being a pending UFA. And, if everyone else is talking about it, I guess why can't Jack Hughes talk about it? I don't think it's that unique. What's unique is that you've got three brothers as good as those three that are in the league at the same time and are kind of either in their primes or entering their primes here in the near future. And so obviously they're difference-making players. Very possible we see Quinn and Jack Hughes, I think, play for Team USA at the Olympics together. And so I think it's natural for brothers, I guess, to want to do this. But now what's maybe slightly unnatural or unusual is just how open of a discussion it is, which is great for us. I mean, I don't know how you make it happen. I guess other than the simplest way would be if Luke Hughes does sign a long-term extension in New Jersey and then Quinn were to become a free agent, maybe he just walks there. Maybe if a year from now he's unwilling to sign with the Canucks, they're looking to trade him to at least recoup some assets. There's obviously varying ways this could happen, but pretty unique. It's not really since, I guess, the Sutter brothers, probably where you've seen such a sibling connection in the league, and that was a different NHL back then. when they were doing their thing in the 80s and into the 90s. The possibility of 3 Hughes brothers on a team. Look, I can get why when they're back home in Michigan in the summers, I mean, they train together, they live together, they're very close family, that the idea of this might take some root. And maybe, what you're seeing from Jack Hughes with that quote, he's trying to manifest the destiny, trying to speak it into existence. The reality is nothing can be done for a little time here, but I mean, why shy away from what you want?
Absolutely. Fearless prediction. Milan in February between Crosby and McDavid and the Hughes brothers and whoever else. That will be the perfect opportunity to see out these dreams of teaming up. I mean, it's happened before in other sports. Like, it would be super cool if like some crazy team up happens in a free agency to come. And then we look back at the 2026 Olympic Games and say, oh, well, these two guys talked about playing with each other. They ended up playing with each other on insert team here. And that's what led to that. And fearless prediction for me on that one.
For sure. And let's just add that to the long list of things we've missed by not having best on best competition for so long. I think it does add a little spice to the season. I think it's something players will be focused on this year. Having been at that Canadian Olympic camp, I mean, you really sense a lot of excitement from those players that are trying to make these teams. I mean, I guess that sort of the interesting aspect of not having NHL players play in what will be 12 years at the Olympics is most players that play in the 2026 tournament will be making their Olympic debut. There's a few exceptions there, but not too many. It's almost like a fresh start for all these national programs and these national teams on the men's side. And you're right. It does create these new possibilities. The 4 teams that played at the 4 Nations have a little bit of a head start, I'd say, because the rosters won't be the exact same, but there's going to be a lot of familiarity there. And some of those guys have played together, and, it's hard to know where all that will go, but, I'll tap the sign again and just say, let's remember that this jumping cap, I mean, it's great for players that are going to sign contracts because guys are going to start making more money. But I do think it also opens up windows and possibilities around the league that haven't been there when we spent 5 to 7 years, ostensibly with the same cap in the low 80s. It did move a little bit here and there, but the fact is basically the brakes were put on teams being able to add more and more talent. You had to get creative to do that. You had to do double retention trades and use all those LTIR loopholes that I recognize, some fans or players didn't like that teams were doing that. They were really doing it because they were trying to get better, and it was hard to get better in a world where the cap wasn't going up. Well, now the cap is not just going up, it's going to surge. We'll be at 113 million before you know it. And that's going to allow trades, free agent signings. I think it could give way to like a really interesting set of movement around the league. You're also going to have some teams that don't spend to the cap anymore. I mean, we've kind of had a league where most of the teams, absent 5 to 7, say each year, are basically spending effectively at the cap ceiling. That's going to go away too, right? You're going to have different teams on different competitive windows and plans. So, all this stuff is not happening in a vacuum, I guess is what I'm saying. These sort of conversations, these thoughts, these possibilities we're outlining, I think they're reflective of the kind of the period of time we're in, which, basically started last spring when the league first announced with the Players Association where the cap would go, and then ultimately got the CBA extension done. Now we got to see how everything how it works in reality. It's still a little bit the theory, but the reality is going to be, I think, pretty compelling for fans that like to see player movement and trades and the like.
I can't wait until the year 2027 when Jack and Quinn Hughes and Luke are all on the New Jersey Devils. Connor McDavid has transitioned over to some Eastern Conference team, and Sidney Crosby is playing somewhere. Not somewhere. He'll be playing with the Colorado Avalanche and Nathan McKinnon. 2027. That's the year where that's all going to happen.
Who knows? I mean, look, and the funny part about Jack Hughes' quote is he left open, like, whether it's in New Jersey or maybe it's somewhere else. Obviously it's not, I don't think he's trying to leave New Jersey. I think he's just saying he doesn't know exactly how it's going to happen either, but it's what he wants to see happen. But maybe there's some chaos where someone somehow acquires all the brothers. It isn't one of the teams that currently employs them. I mean, who knows? The truth is this might take years for the Hugheses. Now they have time on their side to a degree. I mean, Luke Hughes is early 20s. So, a career goes quickly, but this isn't necessarily something we'll see as soon as 2027. I think, obviously with McDavid, there's a window on his contract here. And Crosby, there's probably a window on his career, as much as I don't even want to speak that into existence. But as great as he is, he's only going to play for so much longer.
So the first two topics we got into are a little bit more dream scenario, whereas in Calgary, Rasmus Andersson, it's a matter of when and not if with him, right? He'll be a free agent at the end of next season, but he enters camp in a couple days in Calgary, still on the Calgary Flames roster. We saw the reports over the summer about how it seemed as if Rasmus Andersson only wanted to go to Las Vegas to play for the Golden Knights. When he spoke to the media yesterday at their annual golf tournament, just again, a lot of quote reading on today's episode. The thing that bothers you is fake information that comes out. I saw some reports that I would only sign in one team and this and that. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth. Craig Conroy and I have had a few conversations over the summer, and I would never handcuff him and give him one team. And I'll also read a portion of another quote here that I know has been making the rounds in Calgary as well. Is it smart of me to re-sign now after last season? I don't know. I mean, I've read all season how much I suck. So I just got to come out of the gates hot and just worry about myself and get the team in the best position possible. I know you didn't get to talk to Rasmus Andersson every day. As a guy who did, that is not a guy who minces his words. Those are pretty fiery quotes from one Rasmus Andersson. What do you think of his situation right now?
Well, I think there's some semantics at play. I still believe Vegas is a destination that he would find attractive if that could happen. There was obviously some trade talk with the Golden Knights and the Flames that didn't ultimately result in a deal. But, what's been reported didn't come out of nowhere. Like, this wasn't invented in someone's mind. I think that we should get our minds around the reality is this is going to be a hard trade for the Flames to make at some point, because the reality is he is an unrestricted free agent as of July 1st, 2026. I don't think anyone's going to pay the kind of price that's going to make the trade make sense to the Flames unless they know he's signing with them, unless there's an extension attached to it. At his age, I just don't see giving up a whole whack of assets and not knowing if he's going to be around beyond next summer. So, whether Rasmus Andersson likes it or not, where he wants to play next, and he's totally earned that right. Like, I want to say this, like, if he only wants to play in one or two or three other cities, like, that's his prerogative, because all he has to do is fulfill the duties on his Flames contract this season, and then he can go sign anywhere that he can reach a deal with. So, I don't see it as him handcuffing the Flames. I see it as him obviously having priorities for where he wants his career and where he wants his life to go. So look, I'm not going to dispute the man himself. He says there's more than one team. I'm not sure how long that list is. I do think Vegas is still an appealing place. And look, the Golden Knights are at a point where they, Alex Petrangelo's career is effectively over. They've gone through some transition there. They're a little older on the back end. I could see the appeal for them. They've already made the Hannafin deal a couple of years back. So look, I think that he's going to continue to be sort of linked to them, or thought that could be something that could happen. Maybe something else makes sense. Maybe the Flames, look, they missed the playoffs by a point last year. Maybe they decide not to trade Rasmus Andersson if the opportunity to reach the postseason again is within their grasp once the year gets going. I mean, it's kind of an interesting time in Calgary. You've got some players signing long-term deals, and then you have one pretty notable one here that seems very focused on, hitting the open market and leaving Calgary at some point down the road. So, I like that he's meeting those, like, discussing it head on, but I don't believe the list of places that actually make sense for him is all that long, just because, as a free agent, he's not going to want to go play in a lot. Like, the reality of NHL free agency is, yes, a player becomes free to sign with any team, but most of the top free agents, we talk about them being interested in like 3 or 4 or 5 teams, right? Like, at the end of the day, yes, 31 other teams can sign you by the rules, but NHL free agents typically don't consider all 31 teams equally, for all kinds of reasons, whether lifestyle, tax, competitive window, whatever. And so I just think he's probably only going to one of a couple teams, and those are the only teams that can now trade with Calgary. And, maybe the Flames end up not moving him. I mean, that's the one thing is that everyone seems like they're at least on the same page here, that he's going to come and give his best for the Flames as long as they want him to do that. And I maybe it's not an automatic that he's traded this year. I think a lot of it will depend on how he plays, how they play, and what that trade market looks like.
You really think there's a world where the Flames enter the deadline, they leave it, and Rasmus Andersson is still on that team? I just have a hard time seeing that. They've got,
if they're 5 points inside the playoff window on March 6th.
But what if after all that, either they miss the playoffs or they make the playoffs, but then by July 1, Rasmus Andersson says, you know what, thanks, but no thanks.
I mean,
they've gone through that again. That's why I'm very surprised at that.
Right. It's what feels like, quite honestly, it would have been easier to move him last year. I mean, it's easy to have that hindsight, but to move him in the scenario where a team is getting him for 2 playoff runs effectively, I think it does change a little bit the calculus on what a team might pay to acquire him. It's basically, look at what we're zeroing in on here is asset management. How are they going to manage this asset? I do think getting back to the playoffs is important to that organization. I'm not saying it's most likely they just play it out with him, but let's see how this goes. It would be hard. It'd be a hard message to send your dressing room if you were inside the playoffs and the deals aren't that good for him, because he's only maybe going to move as a rental. And, I don't know, you got to make that choice as a GM. That's what, is kind of lays ahead here for the front office in the next number of months. If they can make a no-brainer trade, if they can replace him in some way as part of that trade, maybe get a younger piece. Plus, that's a different kind of conversation because you're at least not totally punting on the near term. But yeah, look, the Flames have had so much turnover. It's funny, even from your time there at the end of your tenure covering that team, just with all the guys they traded away. And yet they've still managed to be pretty competitive. I believe they finished 1 point behind the Panthers last year in the regular season, right?
Yeah, they did. And I mean, they were tied with the Blues on points at the end of last year too, and they still missed the playoffs. It's just, they've had a lot of turnover, at least in the last year I was there. Excuse me. They were able to make some moves. I just think this fan base would have a very tough time, even if they were competing for a playoff spot, putting themselves in yet again another situation where one of their marquee players is at the risk of leaving for nothing. I just think it would be, maybe it's not everybody, maybe it's a significant faction of the fan base. I just think it would be tough for them to go through that again.
Right. But if the offers don't end up being good because maybe there is a limited number of teams and we'll see.
Yeah.
It's funny. This is like, we're in like the hypotheticals episode. Like I feel like everything we're discussing today is like stuff that could happen in 6 months. So it's almost like beginning a conversation we're going to continue throughout the season on all these threads as sort of situations dictate it. But, I still think the reports that were out there were pretty close to accurate, if not quite accurate, that, again, there's only so many places this guy wants to play. That's all. I'm like that. It makes sense. And it's not his job to want to play somewhere he doesn't want to play just because they can make a trade. Right. I mean, that's the nuance here. And, I'd be very curious to see how they manage this. If they're a pretty good team this year, if they're really competitive, which I think is reasonable to expect. I don't see any reason to forecast a big drop off from last season from where Calgary was. So, and if they take a step forward, then I think it becomes an extra compelling bit of decision-making that Craig Conroy would face as a GM.
Yeah, there's the veterans they have in place. I mean, Nazem Kadri coming off a career season in goals. I think Huberdeau's getting a little bit better since he joined too. And then there's Dustin Wolf, who just signed a 7-year contract extension, which we should get to. He had a hell of a year last year, ends up in the Calder Trophy conversation. I kind of like this deal for them. 7 years, $52.5 million. I'm curious about your thoughts on his contract extension.
Well, it's a big bet, but if you're going to bet on someone, you should probably bet on someone who has been overlooked in their career. Dustin Wolf pretty famously was the 4th last pick in the draft, his draft year. There's a chance, very real chance he wasn't going to get selected at all. Came through the American Hockey League, had all kinds of success for Calgary's farm team, the Wranglers, and then comes up to the NHL and finishes second in Calder Trophy voting. I mean, if you're going to bet on a pattern of behavior and performance, that's a pretty solid one. But, you can't get around the fact that, it's a long deal and it's a player. I think it's fair he's proven himself. Don't get me wrong, but, the goaltending position is notoriously unpredictable at times in terms of individual performance from goaltenders. And, everyone that I hear though talk about Dustin Wolf talks about how smart he is and how committed he is. And so I think that the beauty for the Flames is they've gotten to know him very well over, as an organization over these few years, to the point you get comfortable making that calculation. And, you look at around the league, that 8 million to 8.5 million has become kind of a magic number for good goaltenders. He's not trading in the UFA years that some of those have, whether, it was the Ottinger deal or Swayman deal in Boston. But, he's giving you the 7 probably prime years of his career effectively, starting after this season. He's got 1 year left on his entry level deal. So, I like the certainty it brings you if you're the Flames. I do think paying a goaltender that amount of money will be more and more normalized over time because of the rising cap and what we're seeing other goalies get. So you add that all together, it makes sense. But there's still obviously risk, because if he has a step back, you're paying him in a certain way. I mean, you need to be getting plus goaltending from a player you're paying that kind of money at this stage. And he gave that to them in his first full NHL season, but the challenge doesn't go away as time goes along. The league gets to know you a little better, and obviously you've got to push back and find ways to keep getting better yourself. But if there's one player that's shown you can do that, I feel like, someone who's traveled the road that Dustin Wolf has as an undersized goalie is a pretty good one.
Found a way to win in junior, found a way to win at the AHL level, found a way to be successful at the NHL level. If the Flames find a way to add some scoring, they were one of the worst scoring teams last year. That obviously helps Dustin Wolf's case, but I like the bet on Dustin Wolf. Not to mention too, Craig Conroy also signing Connor Zary to a bridge deal a couple of days earlier too. Very busy times for one Craig Conroy. We're definitely going to talk about the Flames a lot.
They signed Coronado to a long-term deal recently enough. I mean, the good news, I think, from the Calgary end of this is part of the storyline could definitely be Rasmus Andersson is the latest quality player that is looking to leave Calgary. They have also done a pretty good job here of retaining some of their younger talent. That's, meant to usher them back to a competitive window that's supposed to open right around the time they're going to open a new arena there in Calgary. So, I think that there's a lot of hope on the immediate horizon, and there's some positives in getting these players signed. I mean, look, the other thing too is Dustin Wolf is from California, but he's found a home in Calgary, seems to spend a lot of time there in the off season. And so, I think on some level you're making hockey decisions, of course, just what you can do to your roster today. But some of this is pushing back against the narrative, because you certainly don't want the narrative out there that nobody wants to stay where your team plays, because that makes it even tougher to get back to being the kind of team the Flames want to be.
This episode of the Chris Johnston Show is brought to you by DraftKings Sportsbook. Your season, your shot. The NFL season is rolling, and every touchdown can bring you closer to a payout with DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. From first touchdown scorer to anytime touchdown props, or the thrill of live in-game betting, every snap is loaded with opportunity. Thursday night football this week. The Green Bay Packers are hosting the Washington Commanders. Green Bay 4.5-point favorites up on Washington. New customers, this one is for you. Bet just $5 and get $200 in bonus bets instantly. Plus score over $200 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and use code SDPN. That's code SDPN to get $200 in bonus bets instantly when you place your first $5 bet, plus over $200 off NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. In partnership with DraftKings, the crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In New York, call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369. In Connecticut, help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. Please play responsibly. On behalf of Boot Hill Casino and Resort in Kansas, 21 plus age, and eligibility varies by jurisdiction. Fees may apply in Illinois, void in Ontario. Bonus bets expire 7 days after issuance. See sportsbook.draftkings.com/promos. NFL Sunday ticket offer for new subscribers only and auto renews until canceled. Digital games and commercial use excluded. Restrictions apply. Additional NFL Sunday ticket terms at youtube.com/go/NFL Sunday ticket/terms. Limited time offer. All right, we have a Leafs corner again. Our colleague at The Athletic, Jonas Siegel, I called him Beanie Siegel for obvious reasons, had a one-on-one with Craig Berube, the Toronto Maple Leafs head coach. A lot of different topics, including losing Mitch Marner, obviously, through trade/free agency. Austin Matthews comes up a lot. What are some of the other takeaways from Jonas's article that you want to bring up? Also, we got to talk about Nick Robertson as well, and some of the other guys on that team that were brought up in that article.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be a big question, obviously, in Toronto is how the Leafs sort of move on from Mitch Marner. I mean, he literally was penciled in as first line right winger for the last 7 years or whatever it was. Played a lot of minutes with Austin Matthews over that time, and now that's a pretty big open spot. I mean, it's no surprise that you're going to have Matthew Nyes on the left, Matthews in the middle when it comes to Toronto's top line. But I thought it was interesting that Berube mentioned that it might be kind of a by committee thing that maybe situationally in a game or as periods of the season, they'll move different players in and out of that spot, whether it's Max Domi, Matthias Michelli, who they acquired from Utah in the summertime. Although, one thing Berube mentioned in the article is that he's a little unwilling to put Michelli there right at the start of camp.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't want to add sort of extra pressure or expectation. He wants to maybe give him some time to get comfortable before pushing that button. But I do think it's going to be a pretty open topic of conversation. And, one thing to keep in mind here is well, first two things, actually. Austin Matthews, actually, when he's not played with Mitch Marner, has been extremely productive. There isn't necessarily a huge correlation if you look at the career numbers in a spike when he played with Marner. Obviously, him and Marner were a great duo and put up lots of points and, helped win Austin a couple of Rocket Richard trophies and a Hart trophy. But I don't think his success, if you look historically, has been tied just to Marner. He's been able to actually elevate and produce at a pretty good rate, even with playing with other players. So, the Leafs might actually be in a position where they can spread the wealth a little more. By no means am I painting this as a positive that you're losing 106 points from your lineup as they are with Mitch Marner, being moved down to Vegas. But, I think it does open up some opportunities, and it seems like that's something the coaching staff is excited about as they plan for camp. And, getting Dakota Joshua and Nicholas Waugh, there's some different types of players. And so, I think that there's definitely, as I look towards this season, it's fair to say Austin Matthews getting back to full health is a massive, thing the Leafs need to happen to get him back to his usual level of production, at least in terms of goal scoring. Berube mentioned that article too. I mean, that the Leafs looked pretty closely at his sort of chances and everything through last year, and they didn't see a drop off from prior seasons. If anything, he said he actually generated a little bit better opportunities than he had this year before, but he felt like puck luck was an issue for him, that things didn't go his way. So, I think as we imagine the next generation for the Leafs, it's him being back at his best would go a long way, I think, towards, helping them take a positive step forward. And then they've now got, frankly, a lot of bodies around the lineup to figure out how everything slots in. And, that's where Robertson comes up because, between him, David Kampf, Kelly Yarncroke, all three still at this moment on the Leafs roster, I'm not completely convinced that's going to be the case as we get into the season. I do think that it's too many. It's almost too many bodies for how many seats you have on the bus. And I just wonder still, there's some talk out there that the Leafs are open to moving Robertson around the league. Now, that's not necessarily a new development. He did ask for a trade publicly last summer. Hasn't always been happy with his opportunity in Toronto, but, maybe there's a window here. Not saying it has to happen before camp begins, but, teams start juggling their rosters around as we get through training camp and towards opening night. Maybe there'll be an opportunity for them to move on from him or one of those other players in order to create a little breathing room on that roster.
Yeah, Nick Robertson's future being up in the air again, just Feels like a here we go again scenario with that.
Yeah, it'll be a trade if it ever happens that everyone's like, oh yeah, that's been in the works for a long, long time. And look, I'll say this, Nick Robertson only has so many rights under the CBA, but even after wanting a trade in summer 2024, he ended up signing last September, had a reasonably good year. The problem for him was when it mattered most and the Leafs were in the playoffs, he didn't dress too often. And I think ultimately he's a very driven kid, a very competitive guy, and he's on a team that's been deep at the forward position. That has definitely limited his opportunities to some degree in the NHL. He's actually scored at a reasonable rate, given that he's not really playing power play time. He's done a lot of, when you look at, seasons of 13, 14 goals, a lot of those goals were scored at even strength. Mm-hmm. I think it's plausible that he goes somewhere else, plays a little higher in the lineup and kind of meets some of the expectations that have been there for him. So, we'll see what happens. The Leafs obviously aren't just giving him away for nothing. I think they see him as an asset. He's still a pretty young player. It feels like he's been around forever, but part of that is he made his debut in the NHL at age 18 or 19 in that COVID year, coming back in the 2020 playoff bubble. And so he has been around the fringes of the Leafs roster for quite some time, but it feels like the time might be riding a little bit short for him and the Leafs organization, but we'll have to see how things go. We haven't exactly seen a bushel of trades around the league here the last 8 weeks. It's been pretty quiet on the transaction front, and not been an easy time to move players.
One more hypothetical: if it gets to that point, is Brad Treliving more likely to want another young player in return for Nicholas Robertson, or is he more likely to say, just give me a draft pick as an asset?
Well, I think the Leafs need assets themselves for future trade deadlines. I mean, one thing in Toronto is the cupboard's relatively bare because they've been a trade deadline buyer for season after season after season. So, I think they're in a position to be open-minded about the return. It's about getting what they deem to be fair value. But, if it's another young player, if it's a draft pick, presumably it's something that they can use to potentially make future trades as well. Because, the other side of a Mitch Marner, life without Mitch Marner is the Leafs actually have more cap flexibility than normal too. So, they might actually be in the market for different kinds of trades as this season goes along themselves, if those opportunities arise. But they really, the one thing they're missing is the capital to make those types of moves. I mean, they've already traded away their 2026 first round pick. And so, I don't know that it has to be one thing or another, other than they can always use a little bit more value for future moves.
CJ, just one more topic before we wrap up here. The status of the 5 players implicated in the sexual assault case involving Hockey Canada. Bill Daly says he expects a decision very soon on their respective statuses. Any updates we have on that front?
Yeah, well, I think that their path back to reinstatement will soon be made clear. There's been a lot of discussions going on with the NHL and the NHL Players Association about their futures. Of course, this being Carter Hart, Michael McLeod, Dylan Dubé, Alex Formenton, and Cal Foote. Each were acquitted in that trial in London at the end of July. But, the NHL has broad powers, Gary Bettman specifically, to keep players either suspended. I mean, he can expel them entirely under the powers of the CBA. I don't expect that's going to happen. I think that what we're going to see is a phased return based on what I've heard. There'll be a point in time where they're eligible to sign a contract. I don't expect that to be before the start of the season. I think we're talking about, a few weeks into the season, and then there'll be a second date where they're actually eligible to play again. And so, they're all free agents. We should say that. Alex Formenton actually just signed back with a Swiss team through December. So I would expect he'll be in Switzerland until at least December. But the other players are all free agents as it comes to their NHL status. And, as of that first date, which I don't know exactly, but, been led to believe it'll be some point in October, most likely. And then they can, obviously, once you sign with a team, you can start practicing, getting back into game shape, and then you'll be able to play afterwards. But it does seem at this point that their path to reinstatement is getting a little bit closer, and we'll have to see how teams view that. Obviously, a lot of NHL experience for those players, but it's also been nearly 2 years since any of them played in the NHL. So, looks like their future when it comes to playing hockey is going to get a little clearer here in the near future.
Yeah, just obviously the implications with that, if it gets to that point for any of these players, there's going to be a lot to discuss on that and a lot of reactions to take in. I'm admittedly still just surprised that there are teams that would want to take on that reaction, but again, we'll just have to wait and see on that front with that. It's a bit of a weird situation.
It is. Look, and I'm not even taking a stance on either side of the coin. I just look at it as, they legally, there's no challenges to, where they're at. They're still at an age where some teams are obviously willing, like everyone has to make their own calculation for their own organization. Cause you're right. If you were to sign one of these 5 players, there's going to be questions in your market. There's going to be commentary about it. There's going to be reporters at a certain point will be back in front of those players asking those types of things. So, it's happened though before in other sports. It's happened in the NHL where, someone has run afoul of the law and plays that sport again. I mean, it's not unprecedented, but I suppose, what's very notable here, of course, is a very public case with huge implications across hockey. And, we'll have to see where it goes. But, the league, I do believe takes, even if they were found legally not in any trouble in that case, I do think the league takes, what was said about their actions very seriously. And frankly, the fact we're sitting here at this stage of September and they can't sign a deal, I do think says that because, as of this moment, they are actually ineligible. Mm-hmm. What appears to be on the horizon here based on where the conversations are at behind the scenes is they'll be, their path back to reinstatement is going to become clear.
Okay. We'll be sure to cover that story along with so many others as we've gotten into today's episode as we continue our 5th season of the Chris Johnston Show. We'll be back on Friday this week. At some point, we'll get back to our regular Monday, Thursday cadence, but with the way the week's been going, it's a bit weird doing Wednesday and Friday, but we'll get back to normal, and we will have Ask CJ in the coming weeks. Good work as always, Siege. Be sure to follow Chris Johnston's work at The Athletic and follow our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as the SDPN YouTube channel. We'll be back later this week with a brand new episode. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone.